All right, welcome back to another reaction. Today we are starting a new extra history series. Last time we finished up the road to Pearl Harbor, and I decided to do something just completely out of left field, far off from that. Before we were looking at more contemporary, more modern discussions, political intrigue, and structure. Today I wanted to go back. I've been prepping for my AP classes and one of the first things that you do in AP US history is discuss native cultures in North America. And that got me thinking about it and wanting to learn about and go back to some older cultures, older American cultures. And that led me to thinking about the fact that I had seen Extra Credits do a series on the Incan Empire, on the rise, and I believe that it eventually goes into the fall of that. But we're going to go ahead and take a look, and we're going to go through this journey together over the next several weeks, just like we did with the Pearl Harbor series. Either way, let's jump into it. I'm excited to see what they have to discuss when it comes to the Inca and what information they have to provide.
Lima, 1615. The old man clutches a parcel, fat and square, that he's dragged from one end of a fallen empire to the other. He is a mixed-race Christian, the son of an Inca aristocrat and a former translator for priests, seeking to study and suppress native Andean beliefs. 15 years before, he'd had his property confiscated after suing to get his ancestral lands back. Since then, he's wandered the country observing the disappearing Inca life, compiling a chronicle complete with illustrations. It's a history of the Inca, but also a catalog of abuses by the colonial Spanish. His conclusion? Spain must reform the government in a way that protects native people and values their culture. He's carried this book, all 1,000 loose pages of it, through harsh terrain and bandit country. That it survived to this point is a minor miracle. And now, he's finally sending it to its intended recipient, the King of Spain. So Guaman Poma de Ayala takes the only copy of his life's work and hands it to a man aboard a ship. No one will see it again for 300 years.
Fascinating. I've not heard of this individual or this book. I'm hoping that we dive into that further later on. Uh, but yeah, that is insane. That idea of traveling the full breadth. The Western Andes along the South American continent is just breathtakingly large and difficult to traverse. That was one of the most impressive pieces of the Incan Empire was their ability to interconnect themselves along those mountains, the creation of the roads and bridges that connected the empire all together. It's one of the most impressive things that pretty much any empire has done. The rugged terrain made it highly unlikely that these regions would have been culturally or politically unified, but the Inca largely managed it. Now, the Inca, I know, also are going to fall into the same thing that all empires do conquest and brutality when it comes to it. But they also fall under horrific treatment by the Spanish. Uh, Many Incans are forced into slave labor, especially in the silver mines. And the byproducts of that silver production had horrific long-term health side effects and consequences, as well as just direct death caused from the overwork, malnutrition, and disease that ran rampant in the Spanish-run camps. Uh, all right, let's dive further into this.
Ship. No one will see it again? When you get off the plane, the first thing you notice is how thin the air is. And as you exit the airport, a man in a poncho offers you a styrofoam cup full of coca leaf tea to help you deal with the Andean altitude. And your hotel has oxygen tanks in the lobby. Cusco sits at nearly 3,400 meters, or 11,200 feet in altitude.
Oh, it's
When you walk the
massive.
cobblestone streets, you feel dizzy and have to stop for a breath after a few blocks. And then, you start to notice something strange. Every large Spanish building in the city has been built on a foundation of Incan stone.
Yeah, Cusco was the centerpiece, was the capital of the Incan Empire before the Spanish conquest. And they do the same thing in Tenochtitlan, where they tear down the native structures and use the same stone to rebuild uh, more Western European, more Spanish, more Iberian style architectural structures in the area. Uh, and they use the same foundation. If it's a good foundation, they're going to reuse it. Uh, but that reality also just shows kind of the erasure of traditional architecture and art that came in the artistry that came with it. Cusco is also insanely high. I believe that it is the highest altitude capital on the planet. I might be wrong on that. I believe that it is. If it isn't the highest, it is definitely in the running. It's one of the top 5 highest altitude capitals in the world. And that just also goes to show how difficult it must have been to maintain an empire in these high mountainous regions.
That's because the Spanish didn't build Cusco. They merely built on top of it. It was in fact the Inca who, despite the altitude, built a city here. And not just any city, mind you. A city that ruled the largest indigenous empire to ever exist in the Americas. The Inca Empire spanned 2,500 miles along the Pacific coast of South America, stretching from present-day Colombia to Chile. And it ruled as many as 12 million people. But sheer numbers can't really convey what an impressive feat that was, because the Inca also controlled some of the most varied and harsh terrain on the planet, ranging from snow-capped mountains to the humid Amazonian jungle to the Atacama Desert, parts of which haven't seen rain in nearly 400 years.
Yeah, the Atacama is insanely dry. It is a geographical marvel on its own. And then you've got to remember that the Amazon is on the eastern foothills of the Andes, whereas as other region, I'm trying to think of the right way to put this, but the actual Amazon River forms in the Andes. Now, there's a lot of debate as to what spot in the Andes is the true originator of the Amazon River. It's there, and it would have been in the realm of the Incan Empire. Not to mention the fact that they went down to the coast, had these massive high mountaintop cities. It is fascinating to see how massive they become.
Walk the Inca Trail to Machu Picchu, a fairly short route you can still follow today, and you'll pass dusty valleys, lush agricultural terraces, alpine tundra, and jungle. The massive Andes themselves create these microenvironments, forcing the moisture out of passing cloud formations so part of the Inca heartland remain wet, while earth in the other areas stay powder dry.
Yep.
In fact, many settlements stand at altitudes that are difficult to breathe in for anyone but the Andeans, whose lungs have adapted to absorb more oxygen. Actually, after building all of these celebratory churches on the foundations of the Incan capital of Cusco, the Spanish moved the capital to Lima, partially because they couldn't handle the altitude.
Yeah, it was not going well for the Spanish. Spain is very hilly, and that's a conversation for a different time. Maybe at some point if we talk about the Peninsular Wars or something like that. But it never hits the altitudes that the Andes do. I don't even think the Pyrenees, which is the border region between Spain and France, ever hits the same heights as the Andes do. But moving on beyond that, oh goodness, I was just thinking about something with this. Oh yeah, you see a very similar thing with Nepali, Bhutan, northern India, southern Tibet, those extremely high regions where individuals will become adapted to and commonly used to the high altitudes, and therefore their bodies adapt to that lower oxygen level.
But despite the complexity of ruling over and building in such varied environments, the masonry of the Inca highway cuts through all of them, at
Mm-hmm.
times tunneling through solid rock, winding its way through ruins of settlements, fortresses, terraces, and temples. And the Inca built this sophisticated state without iron tools, the wheel, riding or draft animals, money, or a written language. However, they did have quipu, a series of knotted ropes that helped them calculate complex equations and remember numbers and dates.
Learn Spanish.
Yeah, the Kipu is a fascinating tool uh, in the way that they can. It's not a written language, but it is basically a language into and of itself. The ability for you to communicate measurements, distance, time, um, uh, exchange on these different pieces.
Rest of their culture, their folklore, their religion, and their history was all oral. Which becomes a bit of a problem when it comes to telling the history of the Inca Empire.
This is something else, and this is another reason why I wanted to pick this series specifically. Because I wanted to discuss something specific that I was just talking about with a good friend of mine who is also super into history, loves it. And that's the reality that history becomes very shaky when you start getting into regions where there is no written record. When you get into oral histories, it's more in the realm of anthropology. History itself is typically the study of written documentation, and anthropology and sociology is more the discussion of oral tradition or oral history. Uh, and then archaeology is, of course, the items left behind, the ruins, the pottery, the tools that is left behind. So there is a lot of different intersection to actually get the full story of mankind and what we do and how we do it. And I thought this would be an interesting thing to look at because of that. It's also sadly why we don't have nearly as much of a concrete history for a lot of native groups. Um, None of them really had written language, and then even for groups that did catalog and maintain more or less histories and stories and folklore in a more physical sense, like the Mayans with their codexes, the Spanish went out of their way to destroy those codexes, to remove them. And that creates a level of cultural destruction and story destruction that makes it incredibly hard to have real solid backing. Uh, that's for another day. We're going to continue here, but
Because while the conquest is well documented, we have no sources from before the period of the Spanish conquest. Like the buildings of Cusco, where Spanish constructions stand on Inca foundations, all of our stories of
Yep.
the empire come to us to one extent or another via their colonizers. Following the Spanish conquest, dozens of priests, administrators, and former conquistadors set to work interviewing native people in order to capture the empire's oral history. And while these accounts are better than nothing, their usefulness is, mixed at best.
yeah.
See, after the fall of the Inca Empire, a struggle began over the empire's cultural legacy. Spanish authorities stripped the valuables from shrines, leveled temples, suppressed native religious practices, and confiscated the imperial mummies. And part of that campaign involved collecting and telling the Incas' oral histories. Some of the priests collected these stories in hopes it would assist in conversion. But many considered the Inca devil worshippers, or wrote specifically to make their rule appear illegitimate. Just
Yeah, it's there's a lot of twisting that happens, a lot of justification, a post hoc justification to say, look, see, we were right. You see, we found these stories. These people told us that they were bad people or that their rulers were unjust killers. And while in any monarchical system, especially one where singular individuals have a lot of power, you're definitely going to get bad guys. Uh, the Spanish likely, I don't even want to just say likely, I want to say they did make a lot of these stories likely far worse than they actually were, or in certain ways. And you see this throughout this region, not just in South America, not just in what becomes the viceroyalty of Peru after Pizarro's capture, but also in New Spain and up into New Mexico, where the Spanish effectively don't treat the natives as people. They treat them as tools or as things to be subjugated. We see this in the encomiende system, where they're basically forced into slave labor by a different name and forced to practice like this Spanish customs. The mission system, basically the Spanish settlements along the western coast of the United States up into California, and in parts like New Mexico and Arizona. That mission system, its goal was to, if not peacefully, forcibly convert natives away from their native language or native religion into Catholicism.
Justifying the Spanish conquest. Conversely, more sympathetic accounts came from conquistadors who married into the Inca elite and had a closer relationship with the culture. But these two,
which makes sense. This happens a lot in regions like this, where once you have interconnectivity between groups, you get a softening of tone. And it makes sense that individuals who were, would it be, I don't know a good way to put it, those that are not, do not have a deeper connection in with the native population are going to have worse opinions compared to the others.
can display a major gap in understanding. Even after living in Peru for decades, the Spanish didn't really understand the Inca, or any of the other people who lived under the empire's banner.
Yeah.
Their ideas about religion, society, and politics were just too different for these chroniclers to capture accurately. For example, the Inca didn't perceive history in a linear fashion. To tell the history of their four-province empire, they wouldn't start at the beginning. They'd tell the history of the most important province, beginning to end, before moving on to the next most important, and so on. And it's from one of these Spanish accounts that we get the date of the empire's founding. But even that is controversial, and may be entirely wrong. The closest we have to a native perspective comes mostly from a generation of mixed-race authors, the sons of marriages between Inca noblewomen and their Spanish conquerors, all Christians who were born after the empire's destruction. Among them was Blas Vieira, a mixed-race Jesuit, whose pro-Inca views, especially those about native languages being suitable for discussing church doctrine, may have led his order to imprison, then exile him to Spain. Eventually,
yeah, the idea of cultural mixing was not often a positively seen one. And it's definitely harmed by the reality of the social caste system that is established within Spanish colonies in the Americas, with peninsulares or Spanish-born or Europeans on top, then Creoles, Spanish heritage born in the Americas, and then mestizos, children of Spanish-born and natives, and so on and so forth. So by the time we get to these mixed groups that are more positively seen in the Incan tradition, the native tradition, they are literally, at this point, third-class citizens of the Spanish empires that they're living inside of.
He was murdered, and his work burned during an English pirate raid. Only a few excerpts remain from his history, mostly in the work of another half-Inca chronicler, Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, who wrote extensively on the empire's history. But while Vega's book, Royal Commentaries of the Incas, is considered the first literary masterpiece by a Native American, it has problems as a work of history. Because you see, Vega left Peru as a teenager and published his chronicles 49 years later, meaning his memory of the oral history had likely degraded.
Even beyond that, though, the compiling of any kind of oral history is itself kind of a difficult task. The reality is, through time, even with the best of intentions, oral history inherently changes. Things shift, things alter as it goes on. This happens in written history too. Oral history is just a bit more pronounced, and specifically, it's harder to track changes. For instance, the one that I think of specifically is CGP Grey. Has a great video where he is absolutely losing his mind trying to research a story around what state owns what in the Bay, New York or New Jersey. And he's just going back and he's following the written record. He's following the citations and everything else. And it just keeps getting more and more and more absurd. Or just straight up fabrications. And that's where we get to the reality that over time, these things change. We're always dealing with and always working within a game of telephone with history. And with written history, we're more or less able to track that if we have the proper documentation. The problem is a lot of historical works, a lot of written documentation is just gone. Disappears with time. Books are destroyed in floods, natural disasters, thrown out, this, that, the other. Journals are not seen as important by individuals, so they toss them, and then realistically that could have provided a better understanding of what people were going through or what people were dealing with. And so much of that has been destroyed, or so much of that has been changed, but you can still kind of track it. Oral histories, you can't track nearly as much. It becomes a question of, well, where is the origination point? Can we find it? And the answer is probably not. By the time that you have a massive empire the sizes that the Incas had, pinpointing where and when and how a specific tale originates and starts, it's almost foolhardy to try. People do. People put in an insane amount of work researching and trying to find these answers, but it is incredibly difficult, if not straight up impossible, to come to a verifiable, perfect answer.
Mention he was writing with a specific objective in mind, while Guaman Poma rallied against Spanish abuses, and Valera pushed for indigenous language and culture to be seen as equal. Vega portrayed the Inca Empire as a perfect society, one without poverty, where aristocrats, like his family, provided everything a person would need. In fact, it appears that this mode of argumentative history was a hallmark of Andean culture. To the Incas, it seems, history was not necessarily about capturing reality in a fully accurate picture, but rather in molding the past to make a specific point. For example, the Spanish found multiple Incan families in Cusco told elaborate but conflicting versions of the same history, each using it to justify their claim to a piece of land.
Yeah.
And as a result of these conflicting testimonies, modern historians have come to vastly different conclusions about the empire depending how they read the sources.
And I'm gonna disagree with him on one very specific piece here, and that is the idea that this is a facet of Andean culture. It's not. This is a global reality. All over the planet, you will find individuals who have similar tales, but just different enough to give their group their identifiable cultural or political faction is suddenly the good guy who deserves what they need. That is not an Andean thing. That is a global humanity deal.
And because of this, Incan society has been portrayed as everything from a communist utopia to a totalitarian nightmare. And details of the empire's founding continue to be debated. But the histories, paired with archaeology, do tell us this. In the early 13th century, a line of kings began coalescing around what would become the city of Cuzco. Manco Capac, the semi-mythical founder, and as the legends say, one of the first people to walk the earth, established the kingdom of Cuzco before turning to stone. Then came his successors, each taking the ruling title of Sapa Inca, each named for their greatness in construction and war. And they each took names that matched their glory, and were also pretty baller if I do say so myself, such as the valorous, generous Inca, the left-handed, the splendid accountant, the magnanimous, and my personal favorite, he who weeps blood. They built...
That's metal. I don't know what other way to put that. That's actually crazy.
the city and expanded their territory, creating the Inca ways of life and bringing order to a chaotic world. Or perhaps not, because archaeological evidence indicates that many of the things we consider Incan accomplishments, their farming terraces, building style, agricultural products, statecraft, roads, and knotted quipu, were actually inherited from previous Andean societies.
Yeah.
But regardless of their
100%.
source, the Inca were about to use these tools on a scale no one had ever seen. Because in Cuzco, the Sapa Inca had a son. He was not the oldest, nor the favorite of his father, but he was intelligent, brave, and with a ruthless vision. He had a birth name, but that is not how he would be known. He would be known as the Earthshaker, Pachacuti, first emperor of the Inca, and a man who would remake the world in Cataclysm.
Also, a sick name. We will definitely be coming back to check that out next week. But in the meantime, I hope you have a great week. We'll come back and look at the series more in the future. Tell me what else you want to see me react to. Throw down your opinions, your ideas down in the comments, and let's discuss them. I took a much sharper stance than I have on a lot of things toward the end there when we were discussing certain aspects. But either way, I hope you have a great day. See you in the next one. Bye.